The overspending mystery was solved. I got 2 of everything. We quickly disposed of 1 set. I can't tell you how. It's a military secret. The next task was to find a suitable workshop to house the equipment. I was in luck. New aircraft were delivered in huge wooden crates. I don't know if these were on a refundable deposit basis, but 3 of these were snaffled for my and 2 other workshops. I lined the inside of mine with doped canvas, used on the aircraft, painted it, and put it alongside the other 2. We then put a corrugated tin roof over all 3, which made a nice miniature industrial estate. My new workshop served the purpose well, but it was so hot inside that it could easily have been used as an emergency oven. The rusty table fan, which I swear was last used in the First World War, made no difference. However, I didn't have to worry. A visiting brigadier had a solution. "Spray cold water on the roof," was his idiotic suggestion. Have you ever heard such nonsense? I explained, diplomatically, that we were already shaving in the last half cup of our morning tea and showering in an egg cupful of water in view of the water shortage. But if he could arrange it, I would be very much obliged. I guess he couldn't do anything about the water, but he did his best. Shortly after his return to the War Office, I received an air conditioner. Keeping me cool kept the diesel generator very busy. During training back in England, we were taught to adjust voltage regulators by running the wind-driven generators, using a small engine via a fan belt, whilst the plane was on the ground, of course. You can imagine my reaction when I was told we didn't have time for this procedure, and I had to complete the task during a flying mission by lying down on the floor beside the pilot and struggling to reach the regulator. As if this wasn't bad enough, all the pilots flew with the doors removed. The poor souls couldn't stand the heat. Fortunately, I had shed a few pounds and gone partly mad by this time and managed to perform my duty. I won't mention the flight checks that followed. Suffice to say that the stall checks, which necessitates the speed being reduced until the plane literally falls out of the sky, were not my idea of fun. What could be considered fun was my stint as guard commander one night, and that bellowing RSM was the orderly officer. Sorry about these military terms. Read a war book and come back to me. He entered the guard room, narrowly scraping through the door. He was pissed out of his mind. This was a gift from heaven for me. I'm not one for blackmail, but playing my cards right now could surely make my remaining tour much more pleasant. I waited patiently for morning. In walked the groggy RSM just in time to hear me thinking out loud as to how I should word my report. We discussed various options, and he became responsive to a chat about our future association, not knowing whether or not I would shop him for his atrocious behavior. Life was so much better after that. If you're reading this, asshole, I would have shopped you. A soldier had been confined to barracks for a couple of weeks and was seen one night running past the guard room. The guard raised his rifle and bellowed, "Halt or I'll fire." The soldier kept running, so the guard repeated the warning. The soldier looked back over his shoulder and shouted, "My mother's in heaven and my girlfriend's in town, and I'm seeing one of them tonight. That's what you call determination. There's another guy I'd like to have a poke at. I had a toothache once, and an officer that I had befriended ordered me to go to the dentist. He suggested that I not waste time changing out of my overalls and just go as I was, and gave me a letter to this effect. Well, you've never seen such a commotion. The bloody dentist went bananas, and his sodding treatment reflected this. He gave me a written reply to give to my friend the major. My buddy smiled and told me to wait until the cocktail party that night at his house, where I would be helping him out. That evening, when the dentist walked down the street towards the house, the major literally leapt at him and, in no uncertain terms, explained that captains do not send sarcastic letters to majors. The dentist drank alone that night, and I chose never to have toothache again, at least in Cyprus. The star of this next story had more than a toothache. On our return from a day trip to Famagusta, the headlights of the bus lit up a family of local people on the side of the road that appeared to be having a problem. That was an understatement. When we arrived, everybody was screaming hysterically, and a clearly injured fellow was knelt on the ground sobbing. 2 of us went to assist, and my friend grabbed one arm and I went for the other. He didn't have one. There was just a mess of jagged flesh and blood. I damned near fainted. We later learned that he had been driving the family home with the window open and his arm resting on the outside of the door, until an oncoming Coca-Cola truck sideswiped the car and ripped it off. We rushed them all to the hospital in Nicosia. The article in the following day's newspaper stated that the fellow was taken to hospital just in time and lived. No mention of us. British troops weren't entitled to publicity at that time, but we know, don't we? In contrast, We all had a great deal of enjoyment when the Combined Services Entertainment Group came to put on a show. We laughed when this very funny, but unfortunate American comedian kept falling into the monsoon ditches on his way to the officers' mess. Mess is a good word for it. "This goddamn place is full of friggin' holes," he cried. The official star of the CSE show was the late Ruby Murray. She was great. I took several photos, and when she visited us the second time, gave her one to autograph and a fountain pen. She obliged using her delicate hands, clothed in white gloves. Would you believe my pen leaked, causing her to scream politely, of course. Obviously, I quickly apologized profusely and sloped off. The unofficial star of the show was an exotic dancer. My camera started clicking again. I had the photos developed and loads of prints made at the RAF camp in Nicosia. I had to use their instrument laboratory from time to time, so I made contacts there. I sold the prints for about $1 a piece, which was much cheaper than Playboy. I chose not to reproduce this photograph. This is a family book. One of my duties was to check and adjust the accuracy of the aircraft compass. This is done on the ground and called a compass swing. With the engine running and one brake applied, the pilot turns the aircraft to a direction according to its inboard compass. This is then checked by me with a master compass, and the aircraft compass is adjusted accordingly. This particular routine procedure turned into a hair-raising experience. All went well until we flew back to base and touched down. One wheel had seized up and we literally spun off the airstrip. The pilot froze and probably covered the bottom of the plane with brown stuff. But I didn't investigate. I was too busy grabbing the joystick. We soared to safety and, looking very much like a camouflaged crab, landed safely on a nearby RAF strip that was much wider. We called the base for help, and when the brake problem had been fixed, the officer pilot told me to get aboard for the flight back. I politely suggested he go forth and multiply, and cadged a ride in the mechanic's truck. Nicosia was, and I'm sure still is, an interesting place, but during the Cyprus conflict, there were things that sightseers would not rush to see. An example of this was Ledra Street, nicknamed Murder Mile. Wire was strung across the street by terrorists to decapitate military motorcyclists. Gruesome, but sadly effective. I was in a fish and chip shop on Ledra Street one day, chatting to a guy who asked where I lived in England. When I told him Bolton, he asked if I knew Jackie P., a budding soccer player. Small world. Jackie lived directly opposite our house on Talbot Street. Sadly, Jackie never did make the big time. Another coincidence was when I was representing the Army in a swimming competition. I was in a queue for a snack and turned round as a result of a tap on the shoulder. I came face to face with Bernard H. I was gobsmacked. Bernard and I were referred to as the terrible twins at de Havilland way back when. What a time we had reminiscing. By the way, Bernard was one of those hunks that always got the girl. It's not the right chronological time, but it feels good to mention it now. He once told me about a super chick, his current prey, that he had seen at a rifle club in Rochdale. He lived in Wardle at the time. I thought to myself, not this time, my friend. I went to the club, zeroed in, and talked to the lucky girl into having a night out with me. Personality, I guess. Or maybe she was impressed by my shooting. I subsequently married this little gem. That story comes later, but don't worry, it won't be long. I'm sure you are familiar with the term thunderbox. We had rows of these, which were laughingly referred to as toilets. Everybody lost a little pride using ours, as there were no doors. We sat there on this plank with a hole in and watched ants doing their thing. Remember, we are in the Middle East, so it was sometimes a long job. Notice I didn't say big job. A bloke was seen throwing a 5-pound note down the hole. Asked why, he said that he dropped a 6-penny coin, but he wasn't going down for that small amount. It surprises people when I talk about my skiing trip in Cyprus. I guess it seems strange with it being a Mediterranean island. We drove to the Troodos Mountains, rented the necessary equipment, and proceeded up an appropriate slope. Remember, we were in the British Army and could not be seen on a beginner's ski run. I stood at the top and nearly fainted. It was so scary, and only the brave set off down. The rest of us went for a beer. After 3 or 4 bottles of Carlsberg, we reviewed the challenge and thought, what the hell? To the shouts of Geronimo, we hurtled downwards. This we did several times. What fun! But as the effects of the alcohol diminished, so did our courage. On what was to be my last attempt at suicide, I chickened out as I stood looking at the matchstick people at the bottom. It was too late. I literally fell onto the slope, and while struggling to keep my balance, spotted this tree in my path that was becoming larger by the second. I then noticed that there was no snow beyond this potential killer, and I had to make a quick decision whether to hit the tree or run onto rough dirt. I opted for the latter, but soon discovered that a novice has great difficulty turning skis on bare ground. I was fortunate. I only broke a bone in my foot. We returned to camp, and I visited the doctor. The conversation went something like this. Doctor: would you have gone to a doctor if this had happened in England? Me: no, sir. I would have sent for him. Each aircraft is allocated a Form F-700, which records all the servicing details along with the signatures of the tradesman. A senior officer then checks the work and certifies the plane fit to fly. I got a rapid promotion one day when I signed in the wrong place. The pilot casually scanned all the signatures and safely completed his mission. There could have been serious repercussions for me, because in the event of an accident, this book is immediately locked in the safe to avoid destruction or alteration by a horde of tradesmen worried that they may have done a bad repair job. My mistake was noticed later, and I accepted the ensuing reprimand with a grateful sigh of relief. Did you know that you don't have to salute an officer on an airfield? The logic is that in concentrating on formalities, you might walk into a turning propeller. I'll bet you didn't know there is another occasion you do not need to salute. If you sneeze into your hanky, even off the airstrip at the right time, an officer is obliged to salute you. Would you believe that some people actually do take advantage of this phenomenon? This is beginning to sound like a military manual, so I'll move on. All good things must come to an end, and I was persuaded to take a month's vacation in England. Shortly after my return, the whole squadron was moved to Aden. We sailed from Famagusta, calling in at Tabruk and Port Said. We had a meal in Tabruk. Some dead animal, or maybe a shoe, floating in sauce, and so spicy that I felt like I was chewing a mouthful of razor blades. Port Said provided the after-dinner show. The bumboats amused us until we ached. It was so funny to hear an Egyptian with a Scottish accent. The accent, of course, was as a result of the Scottish regiments being stationed in Egypt during World War II. They knew every trick of the trade and how to get money out of us novices. One guy bought a Rolex watch. It did everything but tell the time, until it fell apart. Another fellow bought a packet of American cigarettes, only to damn near choke to death on the Egyptian substitutes. I've never seen anybody row boats as fast as these professionals after they had sold all they could. Oxford or Cambridge would welcome them with open arms. We were learning fast. At the risk of starting an international incident, I must tell you now that Aden is reputed to be the armpit of the world. The smell reached us about halfway down the Suez Canal. We could estimate how far off we were by its intensity. However, it was actually a relief to arrive in Aden. Apart from the fact that we were in the Army and not the Navy, we had spent about 7 miserable days supplementing our pathetic meals by catching extra food from the Chinese crew. I think the War Office must have been on an economy drive when they allocated the money for our rations. We held our noses and made our way to the temporary camp somewhere near Steamer Point. The relief lasted roughly 1 hour, until we discovered that our commanding officer had a funny sense of humor. Apparently, the RAF had offered accommodation in their large, luxurious billets. Our colonel refused, as his Air Corps chaps were tough guys, so the temporary tents would do just fine. What a load of codswallop. They weren't tents, as we know them. They were canvas roofs, supported by mosquito nets on all 4 sides. I guess he figured we needed fresh air, but he did agree that we could drop one side canvas. He had to stipulate which side, so he chose the leeward one. We awoke every damned morning covered in sand. Don't laugh. Have you ever been sandblasted? And talk about room with a few. He knew what he was destroying our morale, as he made it clear up front that he would not approve any transfer requests. And by God, he meant it, as everyone in that squadron will attest. Visits to the local town were always an education. It made us realize how lucky we were. Please don't giggle. I'm trying to be righteous. I've never seen such poverty. The locals had literally nothing and lived on the streets wearing only towels to cover the obvious. It was quite understandable why the place had such a distinctive aroma. Doesn't that sound better than foul smell? But providing one had adequate nose protection. Aden, which I believe is now Yemen, once I left I couldn't care less what they called it, did have its redeeming features. It was at that time a free port, where one could purchase extremely cheap anything and a stopping-off point for the ocean liners en route from the United Kingdom to Australia. It was great fun to hear the locals trying to get as much money as possible from the ship's passengers. They in fact got quite mad if the innocent travelers didn't barter them down. They got even madder when we intervened and openly disclosed a price lower than that which we knew to be the merchant's bottom line. We really needed the laughs. This aromatic center also offered a couple of top-notch nightclubs. These were, of course, out of bounds for us minions, and only officers or the wealthy could get admission. Another challenge. One of my mates was Maltese, who had discovered that if he spoke with a bit of a slur, the locals could understand him. It was easy for him to pose as a local businessman at the door of the nightclubs and gain admission. It was not so easy for me to play my role when he introduced me as an English shipping magnate as his guest. But it worked every time, and we had a ball. We also had a ball of grass, I think that's what it was called, donated by some friendly guys on the next table dressed in Arabian Nights-type outfits, complete with daggers. They told us that it would do away with the need for sleep, and we could stay longer to enjoy the place. Being new to this type of thing, coming from England, don't you know, I didn't sleep for about a week. I must tell you about one mysterious incident. Our camp was surrounded by a 10-foot-high wire fence, and within that there was the motor vehicle pool surrounded again by another 10-foot fence. I was on guard duty one night and the next morning brought cries of, "What the F's happened here?" 3 drivers had jumped in their trucks and tried to put them in neutral before starting. The gearboxes had vanished. How the hell that could happen was the obvious question. Nobody ever found out, and poor Maurice, the guard commander, faced a court-martial. I believed him when he explained that he had absolutely no use whatsoever for 3 truck gearboxes. But the Army didn't. Our lifestyles changed after a month when we were moved to our permanent camp situated in a place called Bir Fukum. That might not be the right spelling, but it sure as hell is the right pronunciation. How the dickens were we going to answer the folks back home when they asked where we were stationed? We trudged along full of excitement. We were going on another outing. They were not kidding when they talked about the barren rocks of Aden. The Black Mountains were like huge slag heaps. We traveled through them en route to our new location and were surrounded by them on arrival. The new billets were steel, windproof, and air-conditioned. The War Office must have used the food money to pay for these. Actually, our new camp was the home of the 17th 21st Lancers, or better known as the Death or Glory Regiment, that had very kindly allowed us to park our butts there. We'll all be forever grateful. It really was comfortable, though, and luckily the last part of the host regiment's nickname triggered in, rather than the first part. One day, one of our guys refused to soldier, which is a technical term, just accepted. His bed was picked up, with him still in it, and hauled off to the guard commander. I thought I'd been in contact with a tough sergeant major. Remember the shorts incident? But that guy was like a padre compared to this hunk of steel. When the rebel refused to take off his uniform, the RSM ripped it off with one swoop and literally threw him in a cell. He may still be there. Nobody dared to interfere. Another incident when no one dared to interfere was one evening when I was on duty, as a corporal, patrolling the various bars to ensure that all our chaps behaved with decorum. In one of these bars, we found a soldier who was not. He was absolutely legless and behaving badly, and was quite violent. The sergeant told me to arrest him. You should have seen the well-oiled drunk. He was huge, and in his inebriated state, feared nobody. I exercised privilege of rank and ordered the 2 privates to arrest him. In the meantime, I called the military police. By the time the redcaps had arrived, the 2 privates, unlucky sods, had managed to restrain the madman and were holding him down in a chair, struggling like crazy. The MPs told them to let him stand up. What followed was probably wrong and cruel, but here it is. The drunk stood up and started to swing a punch. The burly cop kicked him in the groin. That's a polite word for knackers. Kneed him under the chin when he bent double. The badly dazed troublemaker then fell to the floor, and the other, meathead, stood on his face and twisted his studded boot. What a mess! Blood all over the place. It made wrestling look like a game of kiss-catch. We asked them how they were going to account for so much violence. No problem, they replied. We arrested him with the minimum amount of force and carried the poor soul away. Apparently, their answer was quite standard and acceptable in situations like this. So, if you ever enlist, behave yourself. A gentleman dressed in a tuxedo went into a bar on his way home from the office and ordered a pink gin. He looked down snobbishly at the worker beside him, who was in a boiler suit and drinking a pint, and said, "Poverty is the inheritance of the poor, Shakespeare." The quick-witted worker replied, F. Off. D.H. Lawrence. Culture is relative. The camp snack bar, I can't tell you what it was really called without upsetting a whole bunch of people, was staffed by workers from across the water. Without wishing to offend, they were super people but had a real power complex. They readily displayed this when serving an Englishman. We always get it, don't we? I bought a plate of French fries one day. They were cold. After complaining, I got another plateful of fries that were like smoking pieces of volcanic lava. But just a few. I couldn't win then, but I did eventually. I called for and got a meeting between the proprietors, myself, and the colonel to establish the temperature and quantity of French fries. These high-powered business meetings are exhausting, but major decisions just have to be made. Being cheated out of the opportunity of getting a pilot's license previously, I decided to try for a car license. It would be valid in the UK, as Aden was then a British protectorate. I borrowed a vehicle whenever I could, and after a few days of driving between beer cans, relax. They were empty, placed strategically in the sand. My efforts were rewarded. One of the officers said that if I could get him into the local town 30 miles away and back in one piece, he'd sign a pink slip. Have you ever driven in a Middle East country? Surviving all the hazards, I got us back to camp. The officer completed his part of the deal immediately upon his return from the sick bay. I have never, to this day, passed a driving test in England. The one I got over there is still valid for another 11 years. So be careful out there. An opportunity arose to apply for a course back in Middle Wallop to become qualified on aircraft radios. I applied, but was told that I could complete the course upon my return to England. Having failed in that attempt to get the hell out, can you tell that I'm now a little teed off with the place? I was forced to pursue the possibility of a holiday back home. I found out that the Brown Army pay and records books had been destroyed in favor of another system that would never work properly. It flashed through my mind that as only one free trip to England per 3 years overseas tour is permitted, I should check to see if the record of my previous trip had been transferred to the new system. The Army standard of efficiency was in my favor. There was no record of my Cyprus leave. I booked my holiday, but my joy was short-lived. It was 1961, and the Kuwait crisis started. When Iraq first threatened to invade and reclaim Kuwait, my trip home was canceled. Being the only instrument technician in the Middle East, my services were required up there. Actually, if that was the case, and it was, why didn't they pay me more? I was awakened at 5 a.m. one morning. Amazing how silly details stick in your mind, and told to pack and report to the airport, where I was told that I had no documentation and I couldn't travel without it. Would you believe me if I thought, what a disappointment? You're right. I hadn't run very far when I heard someone scream, "We'll make an exception. Get on board." Whoopee shit, I was on my way to the Persian Gulf. The Beverly aircraft is the only one that can reverse props and go backwards. I was hoping for a pilot error and get my holiday in England, but we were unlucky enough to get a proficient pilot and we flew north. We landed for an overnight stay in Bahrain. I couldn't bloody breathe. The place was so hot. I was so relieved when I met a pal who was stationed there and lived in an air-conditioned room with a spare bed. Off we flew the day after and landed in the Kuwait capital. There was no greeter here, and I'd still have been wandering around if I hadn't spotted a small notice telling new military arrivals to telephone this number. I did so and was whisked off to a camp at the other end of the airport. As an instrument technician, I was dumbfounded to discover that I had been sent there to maintain the instruments, electrics, and radios. They must have forgotten they wouldn't let me do the radio course. The Kuwait government had loaned some aircraft to the Army. The Army never spends money on trivial things. I must have done something right. I had to solve only one problem during my 5-week sentence, but it was on a radio. I rushed the faulty radio to the Kuwait Airport radio department and picked it up after lunch. Thanks, guys. Here's the overspending mystery again. I had to sleep on a table with my kit bag as a pillow. You'll happy to learn that I maintained my dignity and placed my hanky under the kit bag. We were all very well fed thanks to the dubious efforts of Jeff H., the supply representative. The pile of food that he acquired was enormous. We had to build a huge table out of canned stuff and cover it with a tablecloth to hide it from the War Office brass inspecting our quarters. They didn't notice, to our relief. Jeff explained his secret. He had told the main supply depot that there were about 30 or so people in our detachment and each food delivery was for that many. Far too much for the 6 of us, but very welcome. A few miles from our camp was a recreation center complete with Olympic-sized swimming pool. Membership was restricted to civilians working for Kuwait companies and officers. How come only England has working men's clubs? We had to try to get in somehow. My mate and I waited on the car park until a lady driver arrived. When she stopped, we approached her and commented on the mysterious noise coming from under the hood of her car. She developed a worried look and explained she had little knowledge of engines. We reassured her that we did and would investigate. We fiddled around a bit, without getting our hands too dirty, and then started the engine. She jumped for joy and commented that we must have fixed the problem as she couldn't hear the noise. She thanked us profusely and took us into the club as her guest. Back to business. After weeks of flying over the Iraq-Kuwait border and generally playing war games, monitoring troop movements, the conflict came to an end. I like to think that as a direct result of my involvement, the Iraqis aborted their attempt to take back Kuwait. It took them 30 years to pluck up the courage to try and fail again. Sincere thanks and congratulations to all the 1,991 Desert Storm personnel. On that note, we'll return to Aden. It felt surprisingly good to get back. Sorry, I can't call it home. I resubmitted my application for leave, but was told I didn't have enough time left to serve on my return to Aden if they sent me to England. However, to stop me groveling anymore, they agreed to send me to our branch in Nairobi. That's in Kenya. Well, I don't know how good your geography is, do I? The holiday was actually arranged on the QT, but officially it was a business trip. I arrived in Nairobi on the day after the city had been revamped. All the streets had been changed to a one-way system. It was chaotic, but still enjoyable to be in this exciting city. Shortly after my arrival, I was lucky enough to be able to stand at the starting line of the 10th East African Car Safari. You can check the date for something to do in your spare time. It would be about early 1962. Now that was exciting and spoiled only by that stupid bastard whose head kept getting in the way every time I wanted to take a photograph. Surprising how many bastards you can think of once you set your mind to it. Another one was the lousy pilot that flew me to Zanzibar. Nobody told me he had recently almost caused a major air crash. He flew into the flight path of a commercial jet. However, we flew around Mount Kilimanjaro and arrived in the tropical island, safe and sound, but with dirty underpants. What a wasted trip. It was raining, and there was rioting about a failed assassination attempt. Apparently, somebody had tried to bomb the president, or whatever he was called, just the day before. We stayed for the day and zoomed back out. Returning to Nairobi, the rules had to be broken yet again. A driver and myself took a Land Rover through Nairobi National Game Park without the mandatory protective wire cage. You think you were nervous when you were deciding whether or not to buy this book? Believe me, you were calm compared to me at this time. However, it really was wonderful to see all the familiar animals in their natural surroundings until the lions appearing at feeding time signaled a speedy return to base. If you've been to Kenya, I'm sure you will agree that tiger beer has one hell of a kick. The morning after one good night out, the guys in the billet asked who had ripped the trim off the sides of the doorway. Oh God, it wasn't a dream, I said to myself. It was obvious now that I really did struggle with the door and eventually caused the damage.